August 17th, 1942. High over the French countryside, the sky is bright and clear, dotted with the silver glint of bombers in tight formation. Below, in a Luftwaffe control room outside Rouen, radar operators murmur in disbelief as the green blips multiply across their screens. These are not the lone reconnaissance planes they were used to spotting. This is a formation of four-engine giants, coming straight toward occupied France. Amerikanische bomber. In daylight, one officer scoffs, shaking his head. A young fighter pilot lounging nearby smirks, tightening the leather strap of his flying helmet. Daylight? He laughs. Then it will be a short war for them. But across the Channel in England, the mood is very different. At RAF Polbrook, Brigadier General Ira C. Eaker, commander of the fledgling U.S. 8th Air Force, watches from the control tower as a squadron of 12 B-17 flying fortresses lifts off, their engines thundering in unison. The Americans have arrived in Europe, and today they will prove their doctrine to both friend and foe. Eaker is calm, but inside he feels the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. The British had warned him. Daylight bombing was suicide. The Luftwaffe would cut his bombers to pieces. But Eaker believed in the machine before him, the B-17, bristling with 13 heavy machine guns, a fortress in the sky. As the first bombs whistled down on the railway yards at Rouen, the German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Shells burst in black puffs around the lumbering giants, shaking their frames but failing to bring them down. A Luftwaffe pilot dives his Messerschmitt through the formation, guns blazing, only to be driven off by withering fire from a dozen defensive turrets. When the battle ends and the B-17s turn for home, the German pilots land their fighters in frustration. One ace mutters to his squadron commander, "These machines, they do not die." Hours later, as the bombers touch down safely in England, ground crews swarm over them in shock. Fuselages are ripped open by shrapnel, wings stitched with cannon, holes, one tail nearly sheared in half, and yet every aircraft has returned. That night, a British officer admits grudgingly, "Perhaps the Yanks were right. Perhaps the daylight bomber can fight its way through." But in Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring dismisses the news with a sneer. "The Americans," he says, waving his hand, "they are only testing us. Once they meet the full might of the Luftwaffe, their flying fortresses will fall like burning leaves." What Göring did not know, what few could imagine, was that these clumsy American bombers would become one of the most feared sights in the European sky. German pilots had laughed at the B-17, but soon they would learn that the flying fortress had a way of coming home, full of holes, yet unbroken. The story of how mockery turned into dread was only just beginning. The summer of 1942 was a turning point. America had been in the war for just 8 months. Pearl Harbor had awakened a giant, but the world still doubted how quickly that giant could stand, let alone fight. The United States had declared a Europe-first policy, vowing to strike at Hitler's fortress before turning its full attention to Japan. But where to begin? The beaches of France were still untouchable. The Red Army bled on the Eastern Front. Britain, scarred by years of bombing, demanded proof that America could bring something more than promises. The skies became the chosen battlefield. Britain's Royal Air Force had learned the hard way that daylight raids over Germany were suicide. In 1939 and 1940, British bombers had tried striking industrial targets in broad daylight, and they were cut down in staggering numbers by German fighters and flak. By 1941, the RAF had abandoned the idea of precision bombing in the daytime and shifted to night attacks, trading accuracy for survival. The Americans, however, believed they could do what the British could not. Their plan was bold, even arrogant. Fly deep into enemy territory in daylight, strike with precision, and return in tight defensive formations. The heart of this gamble was a machine born in the factories of Boeing, the B-17 Flying Fortress, braced. With armor plating, armed with 1350 caliber Browning machine guns, and designed to absorb punishment no other bomber could take, the B-17 was more than just an aircraft. It was a philosophy in steel. Its designers boasted that the plane could fly home with half its engines gone, wings shredded, and crew wounded. The Germans scoffed. Soon, they would find out the truth. But the B-17 was more than a fortress in the sky. It was a symbol of something bigger, America's industrial might. By the end of 1942, U.S. factories were already turning out planes at a pace that stunned the world. Nearly 47,000 aircraft rolled off American assembly lines that year, more than Germany and Japan combined could hope to match. By 1944, that number would soar to almost 100,000 in a single year. This was the scale of the fight taking shape. Duel between Hitler's hardened Luftwaffe and America's still green Air Force, armed with machines built by a nation that had never known total war until now. The Luftwaffe had been the terror of Europe. It crushed Poland, humbled France, and nearly broke Britain. Its pilots were seasoned, ruthless, and confident. Against them, the U.S. Army Air Forces were untested, their crews barely out of training, their strategy unproven. And yet, the Americans believed. They believed in their bombers. They believed in their doctrine. And above all, they believed in a simple, dangerous idea that a fortress could fly. The stage was set. The skies over Europe were about to become a proving ground where arrogance, steel, and blood would decide the future of the war. The Luftwaffe had every reason to scoff. They had humbled the best Europe had to offer. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were predators, fast and deadly. To German aces, the American bomber was just another lumbering target, slower than a fighter, heavier than a Stuka, easy prey for cannon fire. "Let them come," one pilot jeered. "We will burn them over the channel." But when the flying fortress entered combat, mockery quickly turned into disbelief. The B-17 had been built from the ground up to endure. Its fuselage was reinforced with armor plating, its fuel tanks lined with self-sealing rubber to prevent explosions, and its wings engineered to take punishment far beyond the limits of most aircraft. Most important of all, its guns, 13 50 caliber Brownings, covered every approach, nose, tail, sides, even above and below. There was no safe way for an enemy fighter to close in. The first small raids of 1942 and early 1943 told a strange story. German pilots poured cannon shells into the American formations, only to watch the fortresses keep flying, sometimes with a dozen holes torn clean through their wings. Crews staggered back to base with dead engines, shattered tails, and bleeding. Gunners, yet they made it home. One famous case stunned even hardened mechanics in England. A B-17 limped back with its entire nose blown off. The bombardier killed instantly, wind roaring through the cockpit. Somehow, the pilot and co-pilot wrestled the crippled plane across the channel and landed safely. Ground crews stood in silence, staring at a machine that by all rights should have fallen from the sky. The stories spread like wildfire. Newspapers. In the U.S. printed photos of battered fortresses landing safely, turning the bomber into a legend overnight. To American families, it became a lifeline of hope, proof that their sons had a fighting chance of survival. To the Luftwaffe, it was something more troubling, a riddle. A captured German pilot put it simply during interrogation. "It is not a bomber, it is a fortress." But survivability came at a price. In those early months, American raids were small, dozens of bombers instead of hundreds. The Luftwaffe still struck hard and losses mounted. Some missions lost 1 in 4 aircraft. Others saw bombers stagger home with only half their crews alive. Yet even in loss, the Americans revealed a dangerous truth. They would not abandon daylight bombing. The fortresses would keep coming. What had begun as a laughing matter was turning into a grim contest. The Luftwaffe was discovering that brute force alone could not stop the B-17. To win, they would need to break the spirit behind the machine, and so the stage shifted toward a brutal confrontation, a showdown that would come to define the very survival of the daylight bombing campaign. August 17th, 1943. 1 year to the day since the first raid on Rouen. In the gray dawn over England, waves of B-17 flying fortresses thunder down the runways. Crews huddle in the cold morning air, chewing gum, pulling on oxygen masks, checking. The 50 caliber guns they will soon trust with their lives. Their mission, a twin strike deep into Germany. One force will hammer the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg, crippling fighter production. Another will smash the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the beating heart of German industry. The stakes could not be higher. Without ball bearings, tanks would seize, trucks would stall, planes would never leave the ground. American planners believed this raid could shorten the war, but waiting for them high above the Reich was the full fury of the Luftwaffe. As the fortresses cross into German airspace, radar stations light up and squadrons scramble. First, a handful of Bf-109s slice through the formation, then dozens, then hundreds. It is a storm of fighters. For hours, the sky becomes a swirling cauldron of contrails, cannon fire, and smoke. From the waist gunners' windows, American crews see fortresses erupt in fire, engines torn from wings, bomb bays exploding. Some bombers fall in a slow, sickening spiral, crews bailing out into parachutes that drift helplessly into enemy territory. Others simply vanish in a fireball, 10 men gone in an instant. A ball turret gunner named Sergeant Edward Clay later wrote in his diary, "They came at us from 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, high and low. You could see their faces grinning, firing, breaking away. I kept shooting until the barrels smoked. Then I looked to my left, and the fortress next to us wasn't there anymore. Just smoke and pieces. The bombers press on, dropping their payloads on target, but at staggering cost. Of the 376 B-17s that took off that morning, 60 never returned. Another 95 were so badly damaged they would never fly again. Nearly 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. Back in England, the survivors limp home, landing one by one. Ground crews rush forward, staring at planes so torn apart it seems impossible they are still flying. Holes the size of doors ripped through fuselages, wings shredded, tails hanging by a spar. Some aircraft count more than 200 bullet and shell holes. The price had been paid. To the Luftwaffe, it looked like vindication. Göring himself crowed, "The Americans are mad. Daylight bombing cannot continue." German newspapers declared it the death of the flying fortress, but the reality was different. Even battered, even mauled, the raids had proven something chilling. The fortresses could reach the industrial heart of Germany, hit it in broad daylight, and still come home. And worse, for the Germans, it was only the beginning. America was building more planes, more crews, more bombs. What the Luftwaffe believed was the breaking point would, in truth, become the turning point, because soon the bombers would return, and this time they would not come alone. If the skies over Germany were the battlefield, America's factories were the arsenal. For every fortress that limped home riddled with holes, another stood ready on the runway, fresh from assembly lines that seemed endless. It was here, far from the front, that the real secret of the B-17's endurance was forged. Not in armor or guns alone, but in the relentless tide of industrial might. At Boeing's plant in Seattle, rows of workers swarmed over silver fuselages, riveting steel and aluminum in rhythmic bursts. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, once a cornfield, stretched more than a mile long, turning out a completed B-24 every 63 minutes. Across the nation, more than 12,700 B-17s would roll out by the end of the war, each one a flying symbol of American persistence. And behind the machines were the people, men who had never seen Europe, women who had never set foot in a factory before. Housewives became riveters, school teachers became welders, teenagers ran lathes. The slogan, "Rosie the Riveter," was not just propaganda, it was reality. By 1943, women made up more than a third of the American aircraft workforce. It was not just numbers, it was innovation. The Americans developed the Norden bomb sight, a device so precise it was guarded like a state secret, promising crews they could drop bombs into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Long-range drop tanks for escort fighters, radar navigation, and ever-improving aircraft designs meant the bomber campaign was not static. It was evolving. Meanwhile, the German home front buckled under the weight of the Allied offensive. By late 1943, the systematic destruction of oil refineries, aluminum smelters, and ball-bearing plants began to choke the Reich's war machine. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, admitted after the war that once the Americans and British bombers concentrated on fuel production, Germany's defeat was inevitable. But in 1943, the outcome was still in doubt. Every raid meant hundreds of young men flying into fire, knowing losses would be brutal. The only reason those raids continued, the only reason the air offensive did not collapse after Schweinfurt, was because America could build faster than Germany could destroy. Factories working day and night replaced lost planes, trained new crews, and sent them across the Atlantic in waves. It was a war of attrition, and only one side had the resources to endure it. The Luftwaffe had once laughed at the flying fortress. Now, staring at the endless stream of bombers crossing the channel, they began to realize the truth. You could shoot one down. You could shoot down 10. But the next morning, 20 more would come. And the morning after that, 30. It was not just an aircraft. It was the will of a nation, built in steel and powered by millions of hands. By 1944, the skies over Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The once proud fighter arm that had terrorized Europe in the early years of the war now faced an enemy it could not outlast, an endless armada of bombers escorted by sleek new fighters that could follow them, all the way to Berlin. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with its long range and devastating firepower, shattered the Luftwaffe's last advantage. Now the hunters became the hunted B-17s flew in massive formations, hundreds at a time, escorted by Mustangs darting above and around them. When German fighters dove in, they were met not only by the bomber's wall of 50 caliber fire, but by squadrons of American escorts eager to duel. Casualties among German fighter units soared. By early 1944, Luftwaffe commanders admitted they were losing pilots faster than they could be trained. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, would later confess, "The war was decided when the first 1,000 bomber raids struck our cities. No matter what we did afterward, Germany's fate was sealed." The Americans knew exactly where to strike. Oil plants at Ploesti, refineries across the Reich, the vital ball-bearing factories, each target was systematically erased. Without oil, the Luftwaffe's sleek Messerschmitts sat idle on their runways, their fuel tanks dry. Without ball bearings, tanks froze, trucks broke down, and production lines ground to a halt. Inside the Reich, despair grew. Civilians huddled in bomb shelters as city after city burned. Fighter pilots, once young lions, now climbed into cockpits. With dread, knowing odds of survival grew worse with each mission. A German ace recorded in his diary, "We can shoot them down, yes, but for every fortress we destroy, 10 more appear. Our arms are growing tired." Even Hermann Göring, the man who once promised Hitler that no enemy bomber will ever fly over the Reich, could not deny the truth. After seeing waves of B-17s and B-24s over Berlin in broad daylight, he admitted bitterly, "When I saw American bombers flying unopposed over the capital of the Reich, I knew the war was lost." The laughter of 1942 had long since vanished. What replaced it was silence, the silence of burned factories, empty fuel tanks, and shattered illusions. Germany had underestimated not just a bomber, but the will and power of an entire nation behind it. By the time they realized the truth, it was far too late. The story of the Flying Fortress was never just about a plane. It was about an idea tested in fire, proven in blood, and carried on the shoulders of ordinary men. German pilots had laughed in 1942, certain the B-17 was a clumsy machine, too slow, too heavy to survive the fury of the Luftwaffe. But by 1945, no one was laughing. The bomber that was supposed to be a joke had become a symbol of inevitability, a messenger of defeat that came day after day until even the proudest Reichsmarschall admitted the war was lost. The B-17 did not win, the war alone, but it embodied the qualities that did: resilience, mass production, and the will to endure losses that would have broken other nations. Each mission cost blood. Each raid left empty chairs in mess halls and unopened letters on bunks. Yet still, the formations rose into the sky, wave after wave, because a nation of factories and farms, workers and welders stood behind them. By the end of the war, more than 12,000 B-17s had flown in Europe. Tens of thousands of airmen never returned, their fortresses swallowed by fire and flak. And yet, the machine became a legend not because it was invincible, but because it refused to die easily. It taught both friend and foe the same lesson: that in a long war, survival itself can be a weapon. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, once declared, "The bomber will always get through, if you have enough of them." History proved him right. The last months of the war saw the skies over Germany black with bombers, formations so vast they cast shadows over the cities below. For those who looked up, the message was unmistakable: the fortress had come, and with it, the end. In the end, the Flying Fortress stood as more than steel and firepower. It stood as a symbol of democratic resolve, the belief that a free people, when mobilized, could outlast and overwhelm even the most ruthless tyranny, and perhaps the most enduring image is not the sight of bombs falling, nor even the endless formations sweeping across the sky, but a single B-17 limping home on shredded wings, riddled with holes, smoke trailing, wheels barely lowering for landing. Out of its battered fuselage, 10 young men climbed to the ground, shaken, bloodied, but alive. That image was the answer to all the laughter, all the doubts, all the boasts of invincibility. The Flying Fortress had kept its promise. It would come home, again and again, full of holes, but unbroken.